Welcome to the Nikki Blazer Sew Along. Erin here. We are going to be sewing up this beauty. Well, not this beauty exactly. I'm going to be using some practice fabric, but I want you to go ahead and grab your instructions, cut out your pattern pieces, do your fitting, and interface your pieces. And I'm going to show you a really quick and efficient way to get this blazer done and done right. So let's get started. So I've got my fabric all laid out. I'm using this tan colored practice fabric and I'm going to use a pink or purple thread so you can see what I'm doing. Now I am not going to follow exactly along with the instruction book because you have the instruction book with you. But if you would like to have a little bit more efficient or expeditious way to sew, then this is where I'm going to share those tips. So if you are a beginner, I would recommend that you read along with the instructions first in the instruction book, and then watch the video and fill in the blanks as needed. Okay? So I've got all my pieces laid out here, and what I like to do to save a lot of time is I like to pin as many pieces together first and then take them to the sewing machine. So I've kind of paired up my pieces in like the same family. This is my back, my side back, the bottom back, so I got all my back pieces right here. My lining pieces are over here. The bottom in front is here. Got my front facing, my side front and regular front, my collar pieces, and then my sleeve is over there just off camera. So right now I'm just going to pin the pieces together. Everything that can be pinned together, I'm going to pin that together. So I'm going to start from the back because that's just what I'm going to grab first, and right sides facing, I'm going to go ahead and pin those pieces. So I'm just working right here with my back pieces. I'm going to slide this a little bit out of the way. And now I've got my side back, and matching up the notches, I'm going to go ahead and pin that together. And I don't use a lot of pins when I sew, but if you need to use pins, by all means, do what you need to do to make sure that you are sewing properly. So I usually like to just pin at my notches and pin at the top of the seam, the place where I'm going to start sewing, and pin at my notches, and sometimes at the bottom as well. Okay, so I've got my back pieces pinned. Now I'm going to be sewing my center back together, but I just want to sew my side back on first, and then I'll go back and sew that together. So those are pinned. I'm going to set that aside. Now I'm going to take the front and do the same. So I've got the front and side front. I'm going to put those together, right sides together. This also helps to make it a lot faster when you're sewing so many seams, and then you can just press them all together and finish those raw edges. You're kind of doing a little bit of batching. I guess you can say you're going to batch as much as you can. And it just makes your sewing go a lot faster than sew, press, finish raw edges. Like, even when I was writing these instructions for this pattern, I tried to make it efficient, but also understandable for a beginner or a relatively new sewer. So we've got the front pinned, and I'm also going to do my sleeve. So right sides facing. Okay, so my sleeves are done. And now I'm going to do my collar. And of course you need to be working with your interfaced pieces, okay? So refer to the instruction book to interface the correct pieces. So I've got a collar and a collar facing. So just one of these is going to be my collar, one's going to be the facing. And I'm going to pin that together. For the lining, we are going to pin at the side seam only. Right sides together. Okay, so we've got a lot of stuff pinned and ready to go to the sewing machine. We've got our lining, our back lining and front lining. Both of those pieces are ready. We've got both of our collars pinned on both ends. We've got both of our sleeves. And if you're feeling extra adventurous with your sleeves, you can actually go ahead. I've pinned this side. You can actually just move this on over here and pin this side as well. It's no preference. You still have to press both of these seam allowances. So if you want to go ahead and pin on both sides, then feel free to do so. And I like sharing these efficiency tips with you guys because by the time a pattern is released, I have sewn it at least 6 times. So I really know some tips and tricks to help you get going. So I've got the front and side front pieces ready to go. We've got the back and side back pieces ready to go. So we're going to take all of this to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch all of these seams. I'm going to show you a neat trick. So I'm at my sewing machine. I've got a purple thread here so that you can see very clearly where I'm stitching on this tan fabric. And I'm going to show you a trick to increase, again, your speed and efficiency on your sewing. So we've already got a whole bunch of these seams already pinned and ready to go. When you're sewing, and I'm starting on one side of my sleeve, that's what I'm going to work with here, back stitch, and this entire pattern is done in 1/2 inch seam allowance, unless otherwise noted in the instructions, so make sure that you've read that ahead of time. And I'm going to go ahead and use a basting stitch just for this sew along. This is not going to be a real blazer, but you want to use the proper stitch for your fabric. So let's sew one seam here. When you get to the end of your seam, back stitch, raise your needle, pull your thread out a little bit, and then put your next seam in and continue sewing. Back stitch and start stitching. And I'm working with the other sleeve. So you're just sewing all of the seams that you just pinned. Get to the end, back stitch, raise my needle, pull out a little thread, and then I grab something else. I think this is a collar, so I'm going to sew here. back stitch, raise it up. Now I'm flipping over. Oh, I had a little slit in my fabric. Don't pay attention to that, okay? But I'm just raising up my needle and presser foot just for a second to pull out a few inches of thread. Give myself a little slack. And then I'm moving on to the next seam. Does it save you a whole lot of time? No, but it can. You know, it can make you feel a little more efficient. So I raise my presser foot, give myself a little room, and keep sewing. I've seen some people who do this by not, they just continue to sew. I don't prefer that technique on my sewing machine. I do that sometimes on my serger because I think it can take it, you know, being sewn without fabric being under there, but I've read somewhere that it's not good to do that to your sewing machine, so I just don't do it on my sewing machine. So all of these are connected, and we saved a little bit of time because we weren't stopping and snipping all of the threads. So now we're just gonna go back and do that. Just gonna snip the threads. And I'm not gonna make this super clean because we're going to go back, or you're gonna go back, because I'm not gonna do it for the sake of this sew along, but you're gonna go back and finish all of the raw edges and press these seam allowances. So since you have to finish the raw edge, you're gonna have to trim your pieces again anyway, trim your threads again anyway, so you don't have to make it super neat right now. Just cut them to separate them. And that's it. So all of the pieces are now separate. The only piece that I did not fully sew was the other side of the sleeves. So I'm gonna set them to the side and I'm gonna go sew those. And so another piece that you can sew when you go and finish your sleeve is to go ahead and sew the center back seam. So grab those two back pieces and you're gonna sew that center back seam here. Okay, so I've got my sleeves done. So now I've finished both of my sleeves, my center back, and all of the other pieces that we've finished. We've got a collar done, a collar facing done. We've got part of the lining, the back lining and side lining done, the front and side front. And so we've got a lot of seams done in just a matter of a few minutes. So it's time to take all of these to your ironing board, press those seam allowances, finish those raw edges, and then we will move on to the next part of sewing the Nikki blazer. So the next piece that I'm going to work with, I'm going to attach the bottom to the blazer, and I'm going to start on the back, and I'm going to grab the back bottom and align that, making sure the notches line up with the seams, and making sure that seam allowance from the back is pointed towards the center back. And your seam allowance should be pressed and finished. I'm not doing mine because this is just a sample. So I like to pin at my key points. So that's pinned. I'm going to set that aside. And I'm going to grab my front and right side facing again. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to line my notch with my seam line. And we're going to essentially practice the same theme, is pin as much as you can, sew as much as you can, and batch where possible. another piece that we could go ahead and pin is the collar and collar facing. And so right sides together. Trying to spread this out here. There we go. We can pin those together as well. And we're going to be sewing those along the inside of the curve. Make sure that you've trimmed those seam allowances to reduce that bulk, because this is also going to align with the shoulder seam. And you don't want it sitting all ridiculous up there, right? Okay, so you're going to be sewing up the sides and all the way down across the top of the collar. And if you want a little clarity on the top, when you lay that collar out and you see that curve, you are sewing along the edge where the curve is the shortest. And now we're going to go back to the sewing machine to sew all of these seams in the same manner in which I showed you earlier. So I've separated all of the pieces. I just loosely cut the threads. Go ahead and do what you're supposed to do with your seam allowance. Press it flat, finish the raw edges, and then come back to your sewing machine. So next up, we're going to sew the front to the back together at the shoulders and along the side seam. So I've already got mine pinned along the side and along the shoulder seam on both sides. So my bobbin thread ran out just in time. So go ahead and take your shell for your blazer, take those seam allowances, press them, and finish those raw edges. Okay, so I've got the shell of my blazer put together. It's starting to come together. It looks really good. The next thing that we want to do is sew the hem of the blazer together. So fold it up. You've got this angled edge here, and you're going to fold it over like that. It will align perfectly to give you that point that's on the hem. So go ahead and pin that, and you're going to fold up along the entire hemline of the blazer. And a little trick here to reduce the bulk when you're folding a hem and you've got these two layers of fabric here for your seam allowance, and then when you fold it over, now you've got 4 layers of seam allowance. So to reduce that bulk, you can clip your seam allowance to the stitching. Don't break the stitching where you need to fold it, and then point one end of your seam allowance one way and point the other seam allowance the other way, like that. And then when you fold it, it'll fold much flatter. It's easier to do on a table, but it'll fold much flatter and it'll look a lot neater. And your needle is not sewing through essentially 6 layers of fabric. Okay, so I've got my hem pinned, and I'm going to go ahead and sew. And you go ahead and press your hem. Now it's time for the sleeves. So go ahead and grab your sleeve, right side together. You're gonna place the sleeve on the proper side of the blazer, matching your notches. Your double notches go towards the back of the blazer. Your single notch goes towards the front. Okay, sleeves are in. You can also go ahead and turn or finish the raw edge of your sleeve and turn that under and give that a hem. And once you do that, we are going to put on our shoulder pads. So if you've never worked with shoulder pads before, they're very, very easy. I'm going to show you a way to put it on without having to hand sew it. Just pretend my seam allowances are pressed. But I put my blazer, the shell, on my dress form just so you can see it clearly. But you will want to put it on yourself to just get a placement loosely about where you want to put your shoulder pads. So I'm using store-bought shoulder pads that I picked up from Joann's. The way you put them on is for the long edge, the folded edge, to be along the armhole edge. And so the way you're going to tack this on is you're going to sew right down this edge here on the seam allowance only. You're not going to catch your sleeve. You're going to sew on that seam allowance. So essentially your shoulder pad should be attached like that. And then to keep it from doing that, you are going to flip it over to the right side, and then you're going to sew within this seam from the right side through all layers, and it will sew straight through your shoulder pad, so that shoulder pad is not going anywhere. It's going to be attached here, and it's going to be attached here. And then we're going to put the lining over this so you won't even see it when it comes to turning the blazer inside out. And so this is one of my finished blazers. And just show you what it looks like, which isn't much to see because you can't see it. And that's exactly how I'm going to show you. There is a shoulder pad right here. You cannot see it from the inside, and of course you cannot see any stitching from the outside. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. So working with your blazer, again, you're going to be sewing only the seam allowance. Okay, you can base this to the seam allowance if you would like, because we're going to do some more sewing on top of it to make sure that it's secure. It doesn't matter, but for this stitching here, you will want to use your regular stitch. So let's go to the sewing machine and see this in action. So working with my blazer, I am looking at the wrong side of my blazer, but my sleeve is tucked in. Okay, so I'm going to take my shoulder pad, I'm going to align it right over the middle of that shoulder seam allowance. I'm going to open that shoulder seam allowance, and then you can put a pin right there to hold it together. And then we're going to sew. So you want to sew about 1/4 of an inch in, because remember, we're sewing within the seam allowance. And you can base this if you'd like, because we're going to sew over it again. And so this is the result of that first stitch. Now it's secured, it's not going anywhere. And now we're going to flip it over. Looks nice and neat on the outside, so now we need to secure it. So when you're holding it like this, you should feel your shoulder pad. It's right here on your hand. So you can kind of put a pin where your shoulder pad begins to let you know where you're going to start sewing. And you'll want to go slowly. And so what I like to do is use my hand wheel and slowly place my needle directly in this seam here. So I pull on my fabric just to kind of expose the seam a little more, and I slowly sew, keeping my needle right in the middle. It's a technique called stitch in the ditch. So this is what it looks like on the outside. You can't even see that stitching right there. And your thread will be the same color as your blazer, so it'll really be invisible. And on the inside, it looks nice and neat with the stitching line right here to secure your shoulder pad. So it's secured along the seam allowance, and it's secured in the middle, and it's not going anywhere. So go ahead and apply your shoulder pads to your blazer, and then we can move on to the collar. So now it's time to work with your collar, and your collar should be right sides out. The raw edges should be basted together, and it should be pressed flat. So you are going to align your collar around the neck. You're going to match up the raw edges of your collar, the basted end, to the raw edge of your blazer, and matching the seam lines with the collar and the shoulder seam. You're going to pin that together. And then you secure it at the back of the neck with a pin. And then you're going to pin it all the way down here and all the way around here. So when we sew, we're going to sew all the way around. So once you've got this pinned, go ahead and baste it all the way around. And then because we're going to do the final sewing and the finishing of the raw edges when we add the lining to the blazer. So let's go ahead and baste this collar on. So now we're going to do a little hemming. Grab your front facing pieces and your lining, your back lining pieces. And for your back lining and with the attached side lining, along this hem, you're going to turn this up and sew it. Another option is you can add a binding here, or you can use a serger to finish these raw edges. So whichever method that you want to do to finish these raw edges, go ahead and do that. You'll be able to see this method from the inside of your blazer, so choose something that you like, something that'll make you feel good when you look at the inside of your blazer. For the purpose of this sew along, I'm just going to skip that part, but I want to note that you will need to do this step before moving further. Now the step that I am going to do is at the bottom of the facing, the front facing, you want to fold up a 1/2 inch on your hem and go ahead and sew that. So once you've got your front facings hemmed, right sides together, you're going to sew this side to your front facing, matching the notches at the side. So it'll look like that. And then you go ahead and sew that seam. You'll do that for both sides. So now this is all one piece, and we're going to finish it up by attaching right side together at the shoulder seam. So this is the shoulder for my back lining. This is the shoulder for my facing, and I'm just going to put those two together and sew them together. Okay, so now we're looking at the blazer. The collar is up as if it's being worn. I want you to fold that collar down, flat onto your jacket. You should be seeing the raw edges here. Now we're going to place right sides together, the lining that we just put together. We're going to place it on the jacket, pull those sleeves through. So you should be looking at the right side of your jacket, the wrong side of your lining. Okay? And you're going to pin your lining all the way around in the same manner that we pinned our collar. That's why you need to make sure that your collar is laying down so that you have access to the seam allowance. So matching the shoulder seam with the collar seam. We're going to go ahead and sew it all the way around, press it, trim the seam allowance, and finish the raw edges. So we're going to do all of that to the inside, and then we have two more steps, and then we'll be done. Okay, so now that all of this is sewn together, you want to press it, trim these seam allowances, and finish these raw edges if you would like. When the blazer is on, you're not going to be able to see those raw edges from the inside, but if you would like to finish those raw edges, but I definitely recommend that you trim them so that they lay flatter, because if they're too bulky, that will be seen when you are wearing the blazer. It'll just kind of puff up around this part where the collar and the actual blazer meet, so go ahead and trim that seam allowance in layers to prevent that. So to secure the lining to the blazer, we are going to pin the lining to the sleeve seam allowance, and then we're going to sew all the way around and finish those raw edges. Okay, so everything is pinned, and we're going to sew our regular 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is going to be the same seam that we attached our sleeve with. So we're going to go ahead and sew that up, and then finish that raw edge with either your serger or your binding, whichever method that you choose, and do that on both sides, and we're almost done. So now that you've got the lining sewn onto your blazer, everything looks good. And now you can kind of see why I had you kind of hem some things or finish some raw edges before sewing them together. It just kind of, now that it's all together, you can kind of see how that worked out. But everything should be look nice and clean. Your shoulder pads should be secured. Your raw edges should be finished with binding or serging to extend the wear of your blazer, and everything looks nice and pretty. The last thing to do is to secure your facing from flapping around on your blazer. And I have pinned my facing to my hem, and all you do is just take a needle and thread and just sew a few hand stitches just along this area here to secure them tightly, to make sure that your facing's not going anywhere, and it'll be nice and clean finish. Okay, and you just do that on both sides, and you're done with your Nikki blazer. So I thought I would wish you well by showing you a real version of the Nikki blazer that I have for myself. And I want to thank you for joining me on this sew along, a more efficient, I guess you could call it, sew along for the Nikki blazer. And if you haven't purchased your pattern yet, I will leave the link to the video in the info box. So I'll see you later in the next video. Bye.